Hello and welcome to Mythic Mind, where we pursue wisdom on the paths between primary and secondary worlds. I'm Dr. Andrew Snyder, and I'm glad that you're here. Hey there, and welcome back as we continue with our series on the fiction and philosophy of C.S. Lewis. This is a collection of lessons that I put together for an independent study on the fiction and philosophy of C.S. Lewis in the summer of 2024. But now making it publicly available. Last time we did an extended introduction to the Screwtape Letters, and this time we'll be getting into the Screwtape Letters. Now, as warning, the sound quality is a little bit degraded on this one, and that's because I didn't realize till I was done recording this originally that it wasn't pulling from my good microphone, and so I assume it was pulling from the integrated one on my laptop, and so the sound quality is not as good, but still definitely listenable. Now, I haven't mentioned this recently, but you can actually purchase this entire course at a very discounted price over at patreon.com/mythicmind. Go to the shop and you'll find the Fiction and Philosophy of C.S. Lewis course. Now, originally people were paying a few $100s to join this course, but now because I'm making so much of it available publicly, I've dropped the price considerably. It's just $25 now, and that will get you all the videos for this entire course all at once, including the recordings of our live meetings, which I'm not putting on the podcast, and also a host of PDFs for some secondary reading. And so you can get all of that for just $25. Go to patreon.com/mythicmind and check out the shop. All right. Well, now let's go ahead and get into these Screwtape Letters. Hello and welcome back as we dive into the Screwtape Letters. Now, there's some advantages and some drawbacks to doing a course like this, where we're covering so much material, we're covering so many stories in a relatively short amount of time. I think on the positive side, well, we get to talk about so many different facets of Lewis's writing and different ideas he dives into, and also we're able to cross-reference those ideas. We're able to see how his philosophy builds and comes together throughout these different angles we get in these different demonstrations of Lewis's writing. However, there's obviously a lot that we're going to miss in any one of these studies, and this is certainly true when it comes to the Screwtape Letters. We have to take something of a broad level look, which again has some strengths, but also there's some weaknesses, which leads me to think that maybe at some point in the future, I would really like to lead some more targeted studies where, maybe we spend 12 weeks just looking at the Screwtape Letters, doing an in-depth analysis of each letter, and so we can mine this text for more of the wealth that's hidden there within. But for now, what I am going to do is go through each of the letters, and I'm going to bring out a quotation or a short passage that hits at a significant theme, and then we will just kind of go through and build on these themes as we go throughout the letters. And we're going to see that there are some unifying philosophies, some unifying ideas throughout. And so I hope that this video serves as a good reading companion for you as I go through all the letters and share some of my thoughts about what is going on here. All right, letter 1. Your man has been accustomed, ever since he was a boy, to have a dozen incompatible philosophies dancing about together inside his head. He doesn't think of doctrine as primarily true or false, but as academic or practical, outworn or contemporary, conventional or ruthless. Jargon, not argument, is your best ally keeping him from the church. Don't waste time trying to make him think that materialism is true. Make him think that it is strong, or stark, or courageous. That is the philosophy of the future. And so, largely speaking, especially in academic circles, the idea of truth has largely fallen out of fashion. Screwtape says that, in time past, people used to actually change their lives based off argumentation. And if they were convinced that a doctrine is true, that would directly inform the way that they live their lives. But that now we've mostly moved beyond truth and falsity. We've moved beyond good and evil. And now we have this evolutionary philosophy that we've already talked about. This philosophy that we saw in his evolutionary hymn, where good equals what comes next. And so our pursuit is no longer to discover what is true. It's no longer to find a realm of being that we might relate ourselves to, but instead all we're trying to do is move onward and upward, whatever that means, with no clear destination in mind. And so on one hand, we are, with Nietzsche's madman, we are standing in an abyss. We've untethered ourselves from all suns. There is no up, there is no down, there is no left, there is no right. We simply have to have the courage to pick a direction and forge our own path, forge our own reality. And so what we are left with is not the right or wrong way to do things. We're simply left with either cowardice or the courage, the will to power, the ability to, as with Satan, as with the unman, to reach forward and to grab what might be, and then to make that our own. And so this modern progressive mindset is what Screwtape is really trying to foster. And he warns Wormwood not to engage in any kind of teaching exercise. He doesn't want Wormwood to try to convince his patient that materialism is true. Because even if his patient were to accept such an argument, well, then he would be engaging in argument. He would be engaging in reason. And that is dangerous because reason, even if it's used in the wrong way, might eventually lead somebody to the right use of reason. And so when reason is able to recognize its own inconsistencies, well, that might then lead somebody to the source of reason, which ultimately is God. And so, again and again, Screwtape is going to try to foster confusion. Same thing the unman did, that he was constantly trying to foster confusion. Remember, he was using rhetoric. He was using these various stories that didn't have a clear meaning attached to them, but just inspired these feelings of heroism, these feelings of sacrifice, these feelings of virtue and nobility. But because these were all just feelings, they're all just sensations divorced from actual reason, they weren't actually leading the lady anywhere other than to confusion, to a lack of clarity, a lack of reason. Same thing is what Screwtape is here proposing. This is going to be a common theme. The desire to move focus away from reason and into sentiment, into baseless emotion, into a reflection on one's feelings about reality rather than on one's place in relation to reality. And that right there is huge, not only for the letters, but we saw that in Paralandra. It's going to be huge for that hideous strength. It's going to be a major idea at play when we get to the abolition of man, this idea that we're going to focus not on our place in relation to reality, but we're going to be focusing on our response to reality. And in turn, our response to reality is going to be then understood as our reality. This is where we fall into the speak your truth philosophies that are so prevalent today. And Lewis saw this very clearly in his own day. We've only seen the development of these tendencies. We've only seen the advance of Screwtape's strategy in our own day. Letter 2. All the habits of the patient, both mental and bodily, are still in our favor. Make his mind flit to and fro between an expression, like the body of Christ, and the actual faces in the next pew. I've been writing hitherto on the assumption that the people in the next pew afford no rational ground for disappointment. Now, I think it's significant that by letter 2, the patient at hand here is a Christian. And I think what this shows us is that real temptation, that the real struggle, doesn't end when somebody confesses Christian faith. No, this is exactly when it begins. And in fact, the entirety of Christian faith has to be one of repentance and faith, or faith and repentance. It's a constant battle against temptation. It's a constant battle of working out your salvation with fear and trembling. I think that's what Lewis is communicating here by having the patient convert right at the beginning of this of the story. And then when he goes to church, Screwtape suggests that Wormwood would use this against him. And so on one hand, he's going to have the patient think about these lofty ideas like the body of Christ, these transcendent, glorious realities, and then look at the apparently imminent, inglorious people next to him, and to cause this contrast between what you would expect, the images that would be conjured up by something like the body of Christ, and then the material reality of what you find next to you. Now, I think it's worth emphasizing here that Screwtape says that, he's not causing any kind of difficulty on rational grounds. He's simply trying to create this sentimental, emotional difficulty, this confusion that arises between this glorious ideal and this inglorious, apparently inglorious material reality next to him. And as long as he can maintain that irrational confusion, He's done his job in maintaining confusion, in separating the patient further from reason, and also separating his patient from the person right next to him in his pew, as well as from the idea of the body of Christ. Now, I've already said that one strategy here in causing this confusion that separates him from reason is that it causes him to become closed in on himself. Screwtape doesn't want the patient to open up to God, certainly, but even to open up in meaningful relation to the people next to him in his pew. He wants him isolated. And sorry if this is a minor spoiler for The Great Divorce, but think about Lewis's picture of hell. It's a matter of radical and increasing isolation, as the reality that binds people together is rejected. And so his picture of hell is really the postmodern dream, where every single person gets to create their own reality, but in so doing, they do not share reality with each other, and they are thereby incapable of love. They're incapable of giving themselves away in the love that causes them to become more of themselves. And this can happen even while we are sitting in church, perhaps especially when we are sitting in church. Letter 3. Keep his mind on the inner life. That's exactly what we've been talking about. He thinks his conversion is something inside him, and his attention is therefore chiefly turned at present to the states of his own mind, or rather to that very expurgated version of them, which is all you should allow him to see. Encourage him. Keep his mind off the most elementary duties by directing it to the most advanced and spiritual ones. Aggravate that most useful human characteristic, the horror and neglect of the obvious. You must bring him to a condition in which he can practice self-examination for an hour without discovering any of those facts about himself which are perfectly clear to anyone who has ever lived in the same house with him or worked in the same office. And so, again, Screwtape is encouraging him to focus on self-abstractions, to focus on his supposed inner realities that don't have any direct bearing on his actual reality, on his actual place in the world, on what he is actually like in his very real engagements and relationships. And so, again, this is a way of trying to get him to close himself off from reality, to close himself off from his relationships with other people, to close himself off from his relationship with God, ultimately. And so, in pride, he is to focus on these advanced spiritual ideals while neglecting the very real responsibilities he has directly in front of him. He is missing the obvious in favor of the more esoteric. Very often, dreams of mysticism are really nothing more than a cover-up for sloth and pride. And that's a pretty good recipe for becoming an idiot, which is not a term I'm using lightly. I'm using that in the technical sense, where an idiot, going to the roots, going to the etymology, an idiot is really just somebody who has something of their own. It's like a private understanding, as opposed to somebody who is truly wise, who doesn't have a private understanding, but actually has the most public understanding possible. They have an understanding of things as they actually are, including themselves as they actually are. But that's something he's never going to see if he's constantly inward focused. If he's constantly looking for spiritual grandeur, is not something that he's going to find. And this letter and a lot of these letters remind me of this quotation from the Four Loves, in which Lewis says, "Say your prayers in the garden early, ignoring steadfastly the dew, the birds, and the flowers, and you will come away overwhelmed by its freshness and joy. Go there in order to be overwhelmed, and 9 times out of 10, nothing will happen to you." And so, if your goal is to be overwhelmed with spiritual ecstasy, then you're sure to miss it, and you're sure to fall into delusion, into a counterfeit. Whereas, if your goal is God, if your goal is beholding the beatific vision, your goal is not to have a good prayer life, but your goal is to pray to God, well, then you will have a good prayer life, and you will be overwhelmed by glory and truth and goodness and beauty. But if you are pursuing being overwhelmed, then you're not actually pursuing that which ought to overwhelm you. You have to pursue the sunum bonum, the ultimate good, if you're going to actually gain particular goods along the way. Whereas if you are pursuing particular goods, then you're very likely going to miss that which makes good things good. You can't grasp at shadows and hope for substance. But when you gain substance, then suddenly shadows actually gain significance as directing attention toward that which is real, toward that which is substantial. All right, letter 4. It is funny how mortals always picture us as putting things into their minds. In reality, our best work is done by keeping things out. Again, this is going to be a common theme, that the principal goal of the devils here is ultimately to close you off from reality. Because when you're closed off from reality, you become less real, and reality is connected with goodness. And so the only thing you need to do to be evil is not to go commit some great heinous sin. We're going to see this a little bit later on, that you don't have to go out and commit murder in order to give a win to the devils. All you have to do is to close yourself off from goodness, because that is the definition of evil. It's the absence or the turning away from that which is good, that which is best. And so the devils are really just trying to close us off into ourselves. The simplest is to turn their gaze away from him toward themselves, keep them watching their own minds and trying to produce feelings there by the action of their own wills. When they meant to ask him for charity, let them instead start trying to manufacture charitable feelings for themselves and not notice that this is what they are doing. When they meant to pray for courage, let them really be trying to feel brave. When they say they are praying for forgiveness, let them be trying to feel forgiven. And so again, he's trying to use the patient's prayer life. He's trying to use his religious sentiment as a way that doesn't focus attention on God, who is the one that provides these things, but instead to focus on their response to God, to focus on their religious sentiments instead of focusing on the chief end of their religion, who then would provide these sentiments that they are seeking, who would provide these emotional states that they are seeking. But as long as they are seeking the feelings first, they're actually going to miss the substance. Again, they're grasping at shadows, they're grasping at particular goods while losing the reality that makes good things good. To go back to the meditation in a tool shed, they are looking at the light instead of looking along the beam to see that which is producing the light, and in turn all that can be seen by the light. In fact, even as I say that, it makes me think of a short story that Lewis wrote about a man born blind who goes on this quest in order to discover what light is. And I'm going to see if I can find that online and include that in the modules. All right, letter 5. How much better for us if all humans died in costly nursing homes amid doctors who lie, nurses who lie, friends who lie, as we have trained them, promising life to the dying, encouraging the belief that sickness excuses every indulgence, and even, if our workers know their job, withholding all suggestion of a priest, lest it should betray to the sick man his true condition. And how disastrous for us is the continual remembrance of death which war enforces. One of our best weapons, contented worldliness, is rendered useless. So I mentioned this in the introduction, that Screwtape warns Wormwood against getting too excited about the war simply for the sake of war, because from a demonic point of view, war is potentially dangerous in that it forefronts the reality of mortality, and that can be an encouragement toward faith, toward taking the eternal seriously and relating that to present circumstance. That's dangerous from the hellish position. In fact, it's better for the demons when we get that which most of us are seeking, a comfortable life that eventually ends in a comfortable death. Because the more comfortable we are in life, the more comfortable we are in death, well, the less likely we are to recognize death for the evil that it is, to recognize death for the call to eternal responsibility that it is. And I think this is so important when we recognize how often the goals of hell match up with our goal, the goals that we tend to have for ourselves, and that's a dangerous position to have. You know, I teach in a public university, and a lot of times secularly minded students will try to tell me that they are okay with death simply because that's just part of life and that is what it is. But I'm not really convinced that anybody, or at least most people, who take death seriously are actually okay with death. I don't think that's true. I don't think that's natural. I think it really speaks to this, I don't know, maybe even demonic idea that all we are shadows that are here today and passing away tomorrow. But I don't think any of us really believe authentically that that's what we are. That's not how we live. We live as if there is real meaning to be had. We live as if the things that we do matter. We live as if there are better and worse ways to live, better and worse ways to behave and relate to people. Even the most extreme relativists, you push them far enough and they're going to claim that some things are right, that some things are wrong. Most of the relativists I talk to, will recognize that things like genocide is not just a matter of personal preference, but it's actually wrong. Now, in so doing, they'll betray a lot of what they confess to believe, but that's exactly my point. I don't think anybody is truly a relativist. And if for no other reason, then as soon as they try to argue for their position, well, now they're trying to convince you that you ought to believe what they believe, which then also betrays their relativism. And so I think that we ultimately we inescapably recognize that we are creatures in relation to truth. Even if we get that relation wrong a lot of times, it is something about human experience that we cannot escape, that we do have a relation to truth, that we do have a relation to reality, that we are more than just inanimate shadows. And that in turn means that our death is actually something significant. It's something that should cause us to develop a significant relationship with life and with eternity. And if we look past the grave and we don't see anything there, that should give us a kind of dread. And if it doesn't, if we're comfortable with that, then I think that is just evidence that Screwtape has been doing his job. And so, in conclusion for this letter, how disastrous for us is the continual remembrance of death which war enforces. Coming to terms with these difficult realities of life, coming into a crisis moment, is not necessarily a bad thing. Anything that wakes us up from this contented worldliness is a potential good, waking us up to the eternal, giving us the right kind of anxiety that can lead not to inaction, but the right kind of anxiety that propels us to make a responsible decision that integrates us as human selves in relation to reality. And I can very much tell as I say that my Kierkegaardian background is showing. All right, letter 6. I'm delighted to hear that your patient's age and profession make it possible, but by no means certain, that he will be called up for military service. We want him to be in the maximum uncertainty, so that his mind will be filled with contradictory pictures of the future, every one of which arouses hope or fear. There is nothing like suspense and anxiety for barricading a human's mind against the enemy. He wants men to become concerned with what they do. Our business is to keep them thinking about what will happen to them. That is so significant. He wants men to be concerned with what they do. Our business is to keep them thinking about what will happen to them. Lewis says in Mere Christianity that Christianity is a fighting religion, that we have a real enemy to fight against, that we have real things to fight for. But what the enemy wants to do is to fill us with all kinds of anxieties about not what we need to do, not the kind of anxiety that Kierkegaard talks about, the kind of anxiety focused on our responsibility for orienting ourselves in the world. No, this Screwtapian, this demonic anxiety, is the kind of anxiety that focuses us on things that we can't necessarily control. It's the kind of anxiety that focuses us on moving fortunes rather than our relation to fortune itself. I think of both Beowulf and Boethius, which I'm pairing together in the next study for, I think, good reason. Boethius focuses on the establishment of our relation to fortune, whatever that is, good fortune or bad fortune, to fortune itself. And so we are to hold good fortune in an open hand, letting it pass in, but also letting it pass out, not mistaking external goods for internal goods. And so we're not concerned about what's going to happen to us. What we're concerned about is our present responsibility to relate ourselves to being, toward what is ultimately true, what is good, what is most real. That is our present responsibility. We're not responsible for things that we can't control. In other words, we're not responsible for things that we have no responsibility over. But we do have responsibility to respond to the present moment as we look toward the eternal reality. So too, Beowulf, throughout the story, has a very clear understanding of the fact that he's going to die. Beowulf often says before one of these great conflicts, he says that, if God grants me victory, then great. But if I die, here's what I want you to do with my body. And so he is completely okay with either outcome. He's not concerned with what's going to happen to him. But what he is concerned about is his present responsibility to take action, to defend what is good, and to defeat what is evil. And we very much see this play out with Ransom in Paralandra, in that for a time he's falling into doubt, confusion, anxiety. He doesn't know what's going to happen. But out of that anxiety, we get this piercing realization of not necessarily what's going to happen, but this piercing realization of what he has to do. And so he takes action. And in taking action, this cloud of anxiety is dispersed, and he's able to see clearly. And so sometimes the path through anxiety is simply to take action, to stop waiting and to relocate your anxiety, not in response to external realities, but to relocate your anxiety in response to your responsibility to take the right action. And so sometimes you need to stop wondering about what's going to happen and just punch the unman in the face. Letter 7. When the humans disbelieve in our existence, we lose all the pleasing results of direct terrorism, and we make no magicians. On the other hand, when they believe in us, we cannot make them materialists and skeptics. At least not yet. I have great hopes that we shall learn in due time how to emotionalize and mythologize their science to such an extent that what is, in effect, belief in us, though not under that name, will creep in while the human mind remains closed to belief in the enemy. And so Screwtape remarks that at the moment, they're not able to bring together the magician and the materialist. However, he has hope that in time they'll be able to do so, and I think we absolutely see that today. We see that in the name of science, we're able to overturn, or supposedly overturn, basic realities of human biology. Right? We're able to just make people whatever it is that they want to be through science. This is but magic by another name. As science continues to progress and as this evolutionary philosophy continues to evolve, we increasingly get this idea that we can use science, that we can use the instruments at our fingertips in order to make reality into what we want it to be. This is the mythologizing and emotionalizing of what science is. And then we get this notion that because we can do something, it's actually good that we should do it. And so again, we get this idea that the good is simply what comes next. This is something that we see in the Ransom series. This is very much something that we're going to see play out in That Hideous Strength. And it's also something that we're going to see in The Abolition of Man. And of course, those texts are related. Next, letter 8. We want cattle who can finally become food. He wants servants who can finally become sons. We want to suck in. He wants to give out. We are empty and would be filled. He is full and flows over. Our war aim is a world in which our Father below has drawn all other beings into himself. The enemy wants a world full of beings united in him, but still distinct. So again, this gets at some ideas that we've already talked about. The idea that as we move upward in relation with God, he gives himself over to us and we give ourselves over to him. And as we do so, as we engage in this relationship of love, we become more like God, but we become more of ourselves. By God's help, we become ourselves. We become simultaneously more particular as well as more united with each other and more united with God. And there's this connection here even to the Holy Trinity, as you have particular persons in absolute unity. 3 persons, 1 God. And this is something that Screwtape is not able to comprehend. And that's because the Trinitarian nature of God ultimately is the foundation of love with which God relates himself to his people. And then that is the love with which we, as his people, are related to each other as well. And so there is this community of love in which we simultaneously become more unified as well as more particular. Things gain focus. We become a higher resolution the more that we move toward that which is most real. Whereas going the other way, in the miserific vision, as we descend toward Satan, as we descend toward hell, we become less particular. Things become more melted down. Resolution becomes less focused until we all sort of become this one amorphous, hellish blob. We all become united with the devil, but not particular. And so it is this movement, again, away from particular reality, down in toward the direction of nothingness. And so things lose their distinction. Things lose their logos. Things fall apart. Remember, it is in the logos, it is in the word that all things are held together. And so as we withdraw away from the word, things tend to fall apart. And they fall apart toward nothingness. And so it's this idea that things are simultaneously falling apart, but also falling apart toward nothingness, toward a void, toward that which is chaotic. And in so doing, they actually become united in chaos, united in nothingness. Next, letter 9. He, as God, made the pleasures. All our research so far has not enabled us to produce one. All we can do is encourage the humans to take the pleasures which our enemy has produced, at times or in ways or in degrees which he has forbidden. Hence we always try to work away from the natural condition of any pleasure to that which it is least natural, less redolent of its maker, and least pleasurable. This makes you think of the passage from Mere Christianity when he's talking about what the differences are between virtues and vices. And he says that exercising virtue is like playing a piano in which you play all the right notes at the right times, and in so doing produce the right kind of harmony, the right kind of melody. Whereas a vice is like playing the right note at the wrong time and in the wrong way. There's no being to evil. There's no reality to evil. And so the only way that evil can act is in taking what is good, taking what is real, and misdirecting it, in playing it at the wrong time in the wrong way for the wrong purpose. And so that's what vice is. It is a good thing, is a good power that is moved in the wrong direction. It's moving against the harmony. To again refer to the Ainulindale, Tolkien's creation account, this is what Melkor did. All of the Ainur are singing songs in harmony in reflection to the goodness of the god of Eru, Iluvatar. Melkor, however, starts to create his own song. Now, his ability to make music to begin with ultimately comes from God. His evil was in that he used the music to praise himself rather than God. He placed himself at the top of the hierarchy, which is something that he can never legitimately do. And so it is this distortion of order. It is a good thing moved in the wrong direction that causes evil. This is what Screwtape tells us, that all pleasures are ultimately originating in God. And the best that the demons can do is not to invent new pleasures, but to take pleasures which actually are good and redirect them away from God toward self, toward other aims. And as they move away from God and are decontextualized from their right place, well, that's when we have evil. And so what Screwtape and his ilk want to do is to cause people to attach themselves to pleasurable activities, but take them out of their proper context, and hopefully make them even less pleasurable along the way, because pleasure itself can potentially lead people to the source of pleasure, which is God. All right, letter 10. He can be made to take a positive pleasure in the perception that the two sides of his life are inconsistent. This is done by exploiting his vanity. He can be taught to enjoy kneeling beside the grocer on Sunday just because he remembers that the grocer could not possibly understand the urbane and mocking world which he inhabited on Saturday evening, and contrawise, to enjoy the bawdy and blasphemy over the coffee with these admirable friends all the more because he is aware of a deeper spiritual world within him, which they cannot understand. And so at this point, the patient has gained these worldly friends that are obviously operating in a way that's inconsistent with his life as a Christian, with his life with his fellow churchgoers. And so he's being led into this pride that allows him to live this double life. And so when he's with his secular friends, he's able to justify what he's doing because he has this spiritual enlightenment that they don't have, that they couldn't possibly understand, which then allows him to participate in that worldliness while convincing himself that he's somehow transcending it. And then when he goes to church, he can still feel pride there over his fellow churchgoers because he's able to sophisticately participate in this worldly life that he knows the grocer would probably disapprove of, but that disapproval doesn't mean anything because, he's just so sophisticated that he's able to, entertain this sort of above good and evil spirituality. But in reality, this connects back to that previous letter in which we're told that he could engage in an hour of self-examination and not come to realize anything genuine about himself that is obvious to anybody else looking in on his life. And so In pride, he's causing the patient to close himself off from any real self-examination or examination by other people, because he's being held to this elusive, arcane, esoteric standard that is really ill-defined and just justifies him in whatever it is that he wants to do. It justifies him in all the inconsistencies between his Christian confession and the obvious anti-Christian sentiments that he is entertaining. And so he gets to see himself as this kind of superhuman that allows him to stand alone above conventional laws and understandings. Letter 11. The flippancy is the best of all. In the first place, it is very economical. Only a clever human can make a real joke about virtue, or indeed about anything else. Any of them can be trained to talk as if virtue were funny. Among flippant people, the joke is always assumed to have been made. No one actually makes it, but every serious subject is discussed in a manner which implies that they have already found a ridiculous side in it. Basically, anything can be justified by saying that it is a joke. He says that real fun, that real humor can potentially be dangerous because that leads to pleasure, it leads to joy, potentially leads to taking yourself lightly. However, flippancy is actually a great asset to Screwtape because flippancy means that you're not taking yourself lightly, but you're taking virtue lightly. And when you take virtue lightly, you no longer have any real self to examine, because virtue is instrumental in making you a self, in giving you substance, and allowing you to stand against the moving currents around you, and to be something real and to be something solid. Again, and I believe it's Mere Christianity, Lewis says that virtue, even attempted virtue, brings clarity, whereas indulgence brings fog. And so by dismissing the virtuous as a joke, you are surrounding yourself with fog, with indulgence. You're simply taking the shape of the environment around you. You're becoming fluid. Instead of being molded after the human ideal, and in so doing becoming more real, becoming more substantial, you are simply melting down into the amorphous reality that finds its fulfillment in hell. And so flippancy is ultimately an extension of the satanic impulse to take yourself too seriously instead of recognizing your place in the grand order. Letter 12. It does not matter how small the sins are provided, that their cumulative effect is to edge the man away from the light and out into the nothing. Murder is no better than cards if cards can do the trick. Indeed, the safest road to hell is the gradual one, the gentle slope, soft underfoot, without sudden turnings, without milestones, without signposts. And so just as you said earlier about the nursing homes, that their goal is really for more people just to live comfortable lives and eventually to slip down silently and quietly into hell. Well, that's exactly what's going on here as well. That something like murder or these so-called great sins, well, these apparently great evils have an ability to awaken conscience. And when conscience is awakened, so too is the potential for repentance. And so the best strategy for hell is to cause people simply to not think, to not engage in moral reasoning, but instead to quietly and softly compromise, to quietly and softly turn away from obvious truths, to turn away from reason, to turn away from obvious and clear responsibilities, and just sort of let hell happen to them. This is going to be a major theme when we get to that hideous strength. And then letter 13. In summary, Screwtape says that Wormwood should not allow the patient to engage in any real, genuine pleasures, because pains and pleasures are dangerous because they're unmistakably real, and therefore, as far as they go, they give the man who feels them a touchstone of reality. We know pleasure when we feel it, and we especially know pain when we feel it. That's unmistakable. And these pains and these pleasures provide touchstones to reality, and then that's dangerous for the devils, because when we get the sense of reality, that there is something that we can relate ourselves to, well, then we start to develop this idea of a genuine selfhood, a selfhood that's responsible for taking action, for relating ourselves to reality as it presents itself to us. And reality is on the side of God. Remember, nothing that is natural actually belongs to Screwtape. And so the more that people develop a recognition of reality, of genuine reality that comes before them and will endure after them, well, now they suddenly have a context for something that they're responsible for. And so what the demonic strategy is here is not just to maximize pain or anything like that, but to actually cause people to become numb to pains, to become numb to pleasures, to just stoically embrace life as what it is, right? Real life is just what happens. Real life is what comes next. But what they don't want us to do is ask the question of, what do we mean by reality? And so to keep us from asking that question, they just want us to be numb. They want us to simply accept life as it is and say, well, life that happens is what should happen, and who are we to question it? And as long as we have that mindset, we are succumbing to this evolutionary philosophy that has no real good, has no real evil, aside from whatever happens to come next. All right, now from this point forward, we're really just starting to repeat a lot of these same themes, and so I'm going to go through a little bit faster, and it's going to be pretty self-evident where these themes that we've talked about are presenting themselves. And I'll provide a little bit more minimal commentary. Letter 14. Your patient has become humble. Have you drawn his attention to the fact? All virtues are less formidable to us once the man is aware that he has them. But this is specifically true of humility. Catch him at the moment when he is really poor in spirit and smuggle into his mind the gratifying reflection, by Jove, I'm being humble. And almost immediately, pride at his own humility, will appear. If he awakes to the danger and tries to smother this new form of pride, make him proud of this attempt, and so on through as many stages as you please. And so, again, this is looking at the light versus looking along the light. What Screwtape doesn't want the patient to do is to look toward God and to experience humility. What he does want him to do is to look toward his humility and experience pride at how humble he is. You see, being humble is a good thing. But it is a particular good thing. It's a good thing that accompanies that which is most good, which is a positive relationship between us and God. And so as we look toward God, we will become humble. But if we look to the particular good, then we will lose the actual good that makes particular goods good. And so if you look to God, you will be humble. If you look to humility, you will lose both humility and God. Pursue the kingdom, and all of these things will be added to you. But you look for these things, and you will miss both them and the kingdom. Letter 15. Our business is to get them away from the eternal and from the present. With this in view, we sometimes tempt a human, say a widow or a scholar, to live in the past. But this is of limited value, for they have some real knowledge of the past, and it has a determinate nature, and to that extent resembles eternity. It is far better to make them live in the future. And so, again, he wants us to fall into anxiety regarding things that are outside of our control, to focus on what might happen to us rather than our present responsibilities. It makes me think of this quote from his essay, Learning in Wartime, in which he says, "Never, in peace or war, commit your virtue or your happiness to the future. It is only our daily bread that we are encouraged to ask for. The present is the only time in which any duty can be done or any grace received." And so our preoccupation with what might happen in the future is a way to mask our present duties as well as our present need. When we focus on the evils of today and let tomorrow take care of tomorrow, well, that's when we're actually able to engage in real, genuine responsibilities to take the upward path, but we don't have any responsibility to act in the future because we don't live in the future. We live in the present, and so the future can very easily become this cloud of anxiety that prevents us from our actual responsibilities in the world in which we actually live. Letter 16. Screwtape talks about some of the churches in the area, and so if the patient is going to be in church, you want to make sure that he has the right mindset about it, that maybe he's shopping around, he finds the church that most suits him, rather than the church that's going to do him most good, a church that he can submit to, a church that he can really become a part of. He wants him to find the church that is going to cloud his vision the most. And so he recommends a church that is very party-based. And so he wants them to get engaged with some part that's really attached to certain vocabulary that's being used about doctrinal issues. Now, what he doesn't want him to do is to actually get engaged in doctrinal issues and actually understand what's going on. He just wants him to get in arguments about, he says, Mass and Holy Communion, without recognizing anything about the theological arguments that might potentially be attached to these ideas. And so, argue about the changes in the carpeting or the or whatever, these superficial, superfluous realities, but don't let him actually get engaged in substance. Let it all just be party politics. And if you've been in church for any length of time, you know what this very well might look like in your context. All right, letter 17. Next, he talks about the gluttony of his mother as an example of a temptation that Wormwood might be able to employ, in that she is engaged in gluttony, which is kind of a hidden gluttony. Now, for one thing, he notes that people don't really talk about gluttony anymore, but also we think of gluttony as overindulging, but that's not really what she does, because in fact, sometimes at a restaurant, she'll even send some food back saying, that's far, far too much. But she's still overindulging. She's overindulging her own appetites, despite the fact that her appetite might not be for mass quantities of food. It is an appetite that things be a certain way. And so she is preoccupied not with her enjoyment of fortune as is presented to her, but she's preoccupied with her desire to shape fortune into the particular form that she wants. And this is the heart of gluttony. It's a way of using reality to meet your desires rather than maintaining gratitude and humility regarding the things that are offered to you. 18. The whole philosophy of hell rests on recognition of the axiom that one thing is not another thing, and specifically that one self is not another self. And so in this letter, Screwtape talks about the fact that he doesn't understand how God can actually be loving. Right? He doesn't understand this economy of heaven, this economy that we see in the Trinity, of this surrender and glory that actually makes something even more stable and more itself. This economy of heaven that we see in Christians, right? We're told to give ourselves away to God and to give ourselves away to each other in giving ourselves away to God. And in so doing, we become more particular, we become more ourselves. This doesn't make sense. And so for Screwtape, the economy of hell is all about competition. In order for one to achieve its good, the other has to lose its good, which is the exact opposite of what we see in the economy of heaven. In the economy of heaven, you give yourself away and you become more yourself. You surrender Isaac and you actually get him back with a greater stability and a greater relationship. And so this just gets to the fact that hell cannot understand love, because ultimately God is love, and that's something that hell has become hell by turning itself away from. All right, 19. We know that he cannot really love. Nobody can. It doesn't make sense. If only we could find out what he's really up to. And it's just a continuation of that same theme. All right, letter 20. In this letter, Screwtape talks about how they try to constantly misdirect regarding sexual taste. And so he tries to use artists and dressmakers and actresses and advertisers in order to shape the fashionable desires of the time. And so his goal here is to create these shadow realities of attraction, to artificially shape human desire, instead of recognizing the eternal reality of the masculine and the feminine and the way that those manifest themselves in organic material life. For this, consider some of what we get toward the end of Paralandra. The masculine and the feminine are ideal realities, they're unmoving realities, they are eternal realities. But as we focus on particular realities, this is when we start to mistake shadows for reality. And in so doing, we get a distorted picture of what these realities actually are. And if you're not following along with what I'm saying right now, I admit that I'm being somewhat abstract. Just hold that off until I get to the end of the Ransom series and I do that broader level philosophy and mythology video. And I'll get a little bit more into this, but I think I'll just kind of leave that where it is for right now. Next, letter 21. You must therefore zealously guard in his mind the curious assumption, my time is my own. And so again, instead of letting him wake up and think about his place within a broader reality, he wants reality to come under his whim. He wants to reach out and say, mine, instead of saying, here I am, do with me what you will. And so this is part of the same isolating strategy here. This is something that we can all probably relate to. I know that I most certainly can. Right? It's very easy to mistake life, to mistake even vocation, things like family and whatever else comes your way, to mistake these things as distractions without recognizing that what we call distractions is very often that to which we are called. And so instead of holding ourselves with an open hand, giving ourselves away in love, Screwtape wants us to hold reality in a closed hand in order to create our own little fiefdom around us. Okay, and then in letter 22, he talks again about the importance of pleasure and the fact that ultimately all pleasure comes from God, and he doesn't hide this, right? He says, at his hand are pleasures forevermore. And that Screwtape, that hell, doesn't have anything naturally on its side. And so, again, all pleasure belongs with God. And this is why hell wants to distort pleasures, because they can't create any of their own. They can only take what is good and turn it into a negative direction. Now, in letter 23, he talks a little bit about politics. And so, in real Christianity, you are to lay yourself down in love. You are to surrender your rights for that which is most right. In so doing, we actually gain some actual context for the rights that we would be discussing. And he says that he doesn't want Christianity to actually flow into political life. What he does want people to do is to mistake Christianity for political life, or political life for Christianity, however we want to phrase that. And so, in other words, he wants to make Christianity as a means to an end. And so he doesn't want justice to come about as a natural consequence of Christianity. He instead wants Christianity to become a means to the end of securing justice. And in so doing, we lose Christianity, and we also lose justice as well in the end. Next, in letter 24, when it becomes pretty evident that it's going to be difficult to talk the patient out of his Christianity, he instead wants him to use his Christianity as a sense that he's in an inner club. He wants to turn Christianity into a mystery religion in which he feels himself one of the initiates. And this speaks to the impulse that we all have to be on the inside of things, right? We want to be at the center. We want to be where things are happening. And for more on this, I recommend reading Lewis's essay, The Inner Ring, which I'll be recommending next week when we start on That Hideous Strength. But for now, we'll go ahead and move on. Okay, next in letter 25, he says, "But the greatest triumph of all is to elevate his horror of the same old thing into a philosophy, so that nonsense in the intellect may reinforce corruption in the will. It is here that the general evolutionary or historical character of modern European thought, partly our work, comes in so useful." And so again, Screwtape is trying to drive him away from reason, to drive him away from intellect, to drive him into nonsense, and to drive him into, above all else, not concerned for what is right or wrong, but be concerned about what is fashionable and what is not fashionable. And what is not fashionable in the current era is what came before. Evolution is upward moving, ever progressing, and so the worst thing that we can do is to go backwards, to go back to where we came from. No, we want to go always onward, always upward, without asking the question, where are we even getting our orientation for what is upward and what is downward, what is forward and what is backward, right? That's the question that the so-called enemy would have us ask. What is right, what is wrong, what is righteous, what is unrighteous? But no, all we want to be concerned about is what is fashionable and what is not fashionable. Is this the way that history is going? Are we on the right side of history or the wrong side of history? Whatever that means. In fact, I'll talk about a little bit what that means in reference to the unmanned. But let's go ahead and keep moving. Letter 26. Note once again the admirable work of our philological arm in substituting the negative unselfishness for the enemy's positive charity. And I mentioned this, I believe, in the introduction to Paralandra, that at the beginning of The Weight of Glory, Lewis mentions that if you ask people from time gone by what the chief virtue is, and a lot of the Christians would say love. You ask a number of people today, and most of them are going to say something like unselfishness. And that's more, and he says that that's more than just a philological change, that there's actually a philosophical change embedded in that change in vocabulary. We used to say that the chief virtue is actually giving yourself away for the betterment of others. Now we say the chief virtue is just simply leaving people alone. And so we've moved away from a positive engagement with God, a positive engagement with others, real meaningful relationships, and instead we've moved into isolation. Right? Unselfishness, it sounds like a good thing, right? Who wouldn't want people to be more unselfish? However, if that is your chief virtue, then essentially what you're saying is the chief virtue is being a radical isolationist, in separating yourself from the affairs of other people. And that is precisely what Screwtape has been trying to encourage all along. This radical isolation from others, isolation from the world, isolation from God. And that's what we have if our chief virtue is unselfishness. All right, next, 27. As the patient continues in his faith and continues into a prayer life, well, now he wants to raise the intellectual difficulties about prayer. If God really is all-knowing, then why do we pray? We're not telling him something he doesn't already know. If God has already decided how things are going to play out, well, why pray? Are we possibly going to change the mind of God? And so he's encouraging these types of questions in order to make prayer seem ridiculous. And aside from the fact that God commands us to pray to pray for our daily bread, and to pray for the recovery of the sick. And so again, he's trying to get us confused, anxious, caught up in abstractions, instead of recognizing the concrete realities that God tells us to pray. And this always strikes me as a particularly obvious distraction. Right? On one hand, I don't think it's necessarily wrong to consider the theology of prayer and to ask the question, what is it that prayer is actually doing? What is prayer? That's not a bad question to ask if done with the right spirit. But if meditating on the character of God leads you to ask the question, why should I pray? As if it's an absurd thing to do in relation to who God is, well, then you yourself are obviously caught up in absurdity. Because if the God who is all good and all holy and all love invites you to pray to him, why wouldn't you? That invitation alone should be enough to do it, to engage in prayer. And so when we're caught up in this intellectual abstraction that leads us to see prayer as absurd, then we're actually not looking at God. And if we're not looking at God, then the question of prayer really doesn't matter at all. And so this whole enterprise here becomes revealed as a smokescreen that's preventing us from the obvious reality that God invites us to pray, that is a grace. And why would we possibly want to question a grace that we have been given? But grace should be received as the invitation that it is. And then letter 28, Screwtape is again reminding Wormwood that death is not necessarily a great evil for humanity. In fact, he says that if the patient were to die today, that would actually lead to his salvation rather than condemnation that they are seeking. Death is not the worst thing that could befall a human. Damnation is the worst thing that could befall a human. And so here we get this proper perspective that we should not fear death above all else. What we should fear is our attachment to hell. And so what we might see as the earthly blessing of a long and comfortable life very well may be a curse if it's received in the same way that the agents of hell want us to receive it. Perhaps what we see as blessing is actually a curse after all. And on the other side, perhaps what we tend to see as a curse is actually a blessing, moving us into the Sunum Bonum. Okay, and then in 29, we see this fostering of hatred. And he says that a Christian recognizes that he shouldn't hate his enemies. However, he can get the sense that his hatred is noble and justified, and maybe even a Christian duty if he says, I don't hate my enemies for my sake, right? I hate the enemies of the people that I love. But here's the thing. We're not called to hate our enemies. At the very least, we're not called to hate our human enemies. We're called to love our neighbors. We're called to love our enemies. That is the Christian duty. I've been thinking a lot about that scene in Paralandra, where not long after we're told that Ransom discovers the proper use for hatred directed at the unman. And they engage in this fight. They're both bloodied and beaten. They're floating on the water. And Weston appears to be present again. And Ransom's not really sure if it's actually Weston or if it's some kind of trick. But nonetheless, in hope, in compassion, he acts as if this is Weston. And Weston, or at least apparently Weston, says that he's afraid of dying. He doesn't want to go back. And this is really just a horrifying scene here. But then Ransom says to Weston, say a prayer. Say a child's prayer if you can't say a man's. Repent your sins and take my hand. And so even despite everything that they've gone through, despite the fact that Ransom recognizes the proper place of hatred, he still has grace and compassion and mercy extended toward Weston. And he says something to this effect in Mere Christianity, that we absolutely should hate what is evil, but we should be sorry that evil is being committed by a human made in the image of God. And so hatred of the image of God, as twisted and perverted as it may be, is never justified for the Christian. How can we possibly hate the image of God, the image of the ultimate good, the image of our Lord? What we should hate is that which would distort that image. And so we hate what is evil, but we love what is good. And the image of God, however distorted it may be, is good. And we are never justified in hating that. And so we need to be very careful and to make sure that we are finding the right place for hatred, but that we never lose the right place for love and compassion and hope and mercy. All right, next, letter 30. The general rule, which we have now pretty well established among them, is that in all experiences which can really make them happier or better, only the physical facts are real, while the spiritual elements are subjective. In all experiences which can discourage or corrupt them, the spiritual elements are the main reality, and to ignore them is to be an escapist. Thus, in birth, the blood and pain are real, the rejoicing a mere subjective point of view. In death, the terror and ugliness reveal what death really means. And so, Screwtape wants to rob us of any real pleasure, of feeling like the love and joy we have at a newborn child, to make us think that that is subjective, that's not real, that that is escapism. But then when it comes to more horrifying realities, things like death, well, then real death is the terror and ugliness that is revealed in the face of its occurrence. And so, in other words, reality is always that which we most don't want it to be. This is the miserific vision, that the goods that we experience are illusions and the horrors are reality. And honestly, I hear this kind of talk a lot in philosophical circles, especially in pop philosophical circles, especially on the college campus. And this idea that goods are illusory and evils are what is most real. And this reminds me of that scene in Paralandra, where Weston, or the Unman, is really just giving us this horrifying outlook on life in relation to death, which he considers to be the most real reality. He says, "We are born on the surface of it, and all our lives we are sinking through it. When we've got all the way through, then we are what's called dead. We've got into the dark part inside, the real globe. If your God exists, he's not in the globe. He's outside like a moon. As we pass into the interior, we pass out of his ken. He doesn't follow us in. You would express it by saying he's not in time, which you think comforting. In other words, he stays put, out in the light and air outside. But we are in time. We move with the times. That is, from his point of view, we move away into what he regards as non-entity, where he never follows. That is all there is to us, all there ever was. He may be there in what you call life, or he may not. What difference does it make? We're not going to be there for long." And so, Weston, or the Unman, if we can even disentangle them, which I'm not sure that we can, he's really taking the horror of death and making that his philosophy for what life really is, right? It is that horror of death that is real life. That is the real globe, or at least the indication of the real globe, the real world, which is non-entity. This is radical nihilism. And obviously, from a Christian perspective, from Lewis's perspective, there's a lot in this argument that we can rebuke. I mean, obviously, for example, God did enter into death. He did enter into the crust, and he went below the crust, that we might go with him to where he is. Right? That is the gospel, that Christ did follow us into non-entity, if we even want to use that language, to bring us into entity. He went into the shadows that we might be made real. He went into death that we might go to where he is in life. But the devil at work here is not able to recognize that external reality. All he sees is the horror of nothingness. As Nietzsche says, if you stare into the abyss long enough, the abyss is going to stare back. Well, I think that's true. Just as if you stare at God with the right vision, he will stare back, and in so doing, fill your vision with love, with beauty, with truth, and with goodness. And so your vision is going to reflect that at which you are looking. And so if you are looking toward nothingness, you are looking toward the grave, then that is what's going to fill your vision. And everything between where you are now and that end is going to be marked with that vision. And so in this horrible scene, I think we actually get something rather profound, that the direction that we are looking is going to shape the things that we see. You look toward God, and everything gains a luminosity, a beauty, a goodness, no matter how difficult your particular circumstance may be. So too, if you look away from God, you look toward nothingness, well, that's going to impact your vision of everything. Even particular goods are going to lose their goodness, and they're going to fade into this miserific vision. Now finally, in letter 31, the patient has died, and he has gone into the arms of God. Wormwood has been defeated, and Screwtape is pretty clear that he's going to consume Wormwood for his failure. But the patient is caught up into that world where pain and pleasure take on transfinite values, and all our arithmetic is dismayed. And so he has ascended from the particular to the universal. He has transcended from particular goods and pleasures up toward that which is chiefly good, namely God, at whose right hand are pleasures forevermore. And pleasure and pain are both transmuted into this higher eternal glory. And I've been trying to not reference too much stories that we haven't gotten to yet, but I do want to provide this quote from The Great Divorce. "They say of some temporal suffering, no future bliss can make up for it, not knowing that heaven, once attained, will work backwards and turn even that agony into a glory." And so pain and pleasure are both transmuted as their true good in the providence of salvation is revealed. And so again, as I've said many times now, Lewis gives us this picture that the beatific vision, which is the chief end of humanity, is what we are made for, to behold and to rejoice in the glory and goodness of God, that this fulfillment works backward, so the path that leads us there itself becomes good and glorious. It becomes beautiful, becomes illuminated. And all the peaks and all the valleys and all the pleasures and all the sufferings, they all work together for this glorious purpose, and in turn they are made to be glorious. They lead us toward participation in the unchanging goodness of God. So too, the miserific vision causes all earthly sufferings to become worse and all earthly goods to lose their goodness and fall into misery. But everything comes to a point in the end. All right, next let's run through some quotations from Screwtape Proposes a Toast. Now, I think this is a great little text. I think that this should be a standard text for political science and for education. I think it's something that for sure every parent should read. It's something that I think every teenager should read. Provides some great insights regarding how we think about government, even more importantly, how we think about our own just individual engagement with society and understanding of the history of ideas. Now, first, Screwtape laments that hell has not received any great quality of sinners lately, but it has received great quantity. And that this is actually good in the end. So what it means is that they've gotten really good at not leading people into moral, spiritual crisis. They've gotten really good at leading people softly and silently into hell. And so they said that ultimately this is a change for the better. And this reminds me of a quote from Chesterton in Orthodoxy when he says, "The sages, it is often said, can see no answer to the riddle of religion. But the trouble with our sages is not that they cannot see the answer, is that they cannot even see the riddle." And so many people don't really wrestle with the question of religion anymore. They don't really see the point. They've mistaken the so-called reality before them as the ultimate reality. They've mistaken the particular for the universal. They've mistaken the shadow for the substance. And teaching philosophy on a college campus, I mean, this just is absolutely the case with so many people. The majority of people today, at least anecdotally speaking, I can say, don't really recognize the riddle of religion. They don't recognize that there is a riddle to be had. They only recognize material reality or individualistically manufactured reality as the real reality, the only real reality to be had. And so what we have today are not people who are trying to engage in sorcery or the openly diabolical. We have people who don't recognize the diabolical as a category. I don't even mean like metaphysically. I'm not just saying that people don't believe in demons, but people don't believe in the demonic. People don't believe in categories of good and evil. And this is exactly the kind of confusion, the kind of ambiguity that Screwtape has been trying to foster all along. And then he talks a little bit about the ambiguity that can come from our words like democracy, or words like liberty. He says that people don't really ask the question that Aristotle raised about what we mean by democratic activity. Right? Is democratic activity that which supports democracy, or is democratic activity simply what people democratically want to do? And so there's a lot of ambiguity regarding what we mean by democracy, what the democratic ideals are. And so this just creates more confusion, more ambiguity. In reality, the way that democracy tends to be used now is that democracy is simply that which makes people the same. He focuses in on this idea of equality. Right? We say that we are all equal, that everybody's just as good as somebody else. And in a basic kind of value statement level, yeah, of course that's true, that an image bearer of God is just as valuable as any other image bearer of God. However, we use this truth as a way to say that there are no real strengths, there are no real weaknesses. We use this equality idea, this democratic ideal, to undermine the very idea of hierarchy as such. And this isn't hard to argue, right? Ask most people on the street, and throw up a Twitter poll and ask, is hierarchy good? And see what the responses are. There's definitely a movement against the idea of hierarchy. There's this idea that anytime somebody is above somebody else, that is a problem. But the problem is, if we don't have hierarchy, then for one thing, our society is going to be radically incompetent, because we're not going to have people who are actually good at doing certain things, doing those certain things. And so competency takes a major hit under this understanding of democracy, this anti-hierarchical version of democracy. Also, if there is no hierarchy, then that means that there's no real goal that you can strive for, because wherever you currently are in any kind of spectrum we can talk about is just as good as anywhere else. In fact, this makes me think of the sophist Protagoras. As with the other sophists, Protagoras didn't believe in absolute truth. He didn't believe that there is a real reality to discover. He simply believed that reality is something that we manufacture, that we decide what good and evil is. And Plato, in his dialogue about Protagoras, has Socrates talking to Protagoras, and at one point Socrates says, Protagoras, what is it that you do for a living? And Protagoras says that I'm a teacher. And Socrates says that he finds that very puzzling, because as soon as you tell your students that what they believe is just as valid as what you believe, what more can you possibly teach them, right? And this is the same basic fault in this version of democracy that Screwtape is extolling. It's the democracy that says that nobody is better than anybody at anything, which is obviously absurd, but also leads to really this pride. Is the abolition of humility. As Screwtape says, it is simply envy in a different name. I'm not going to read all these quotes that I put here on the slides. You can take a look at the PowerPoint to see the quotes that I'm highlighting, but in various ways he speaks to this reality here. The idea that we have eliminated freedom in the name of freedom. We've eliminated strength in the ideals of equality. We have eliminated justice in the name of justice. We have eliminated any kind of genuine democracy in the name of democracy. And he says that what I want to focus your attention on is the vast overall movement toward the discrediting and finally the elimination of every kind of human excellence, moral, cultural, social, or intellectual. And is it not pretty to notice how democracy is now doing for us the work that was once done by the most ancient dictatorships, and by the same methods? And so just as dictators of old, the modern democracy is trying to cut off what's at the top of society in order to make everyone equal. So it's not about raising people from the bottom up to the top, it's about lowering the top down to the bottom, and then saying, we've achieved equality. And so not only is this obviously going to be damaging on a temporal societal level, but ultimately what this is doing is it's a way of masking envy, and it's a way of eliminating moral, cultural, social, and intellectual goods. And of course, every good thing, every human excellence calls us upward toward the ideal of human existence, which ultimately is in reflecting the image of God. And along these lines, he says, I think, some pretty helpful things about education. He says that the basic principle of the new education is to be that dunces and idlers must not be made to feel inferior to intelligent and industrious pupils. That would be undemocratic. And again, in a word, we may reasonably hope for the virtual abolition of education when I'm as good as you has fully had its way. All incentives to learn and all penalties for not learning will be prevented. Who are they to overtop their fellows? And so what Lewis is giving us here is not just a socio-political commentary, although he absolutely is providing that. But what he's demonstrating is that this version of democracy that lowers the top down to the bottom rather than attempting to raise the bottom up to the top is actually a spiritual attack. It's a theological attack. It is a demonic attack that's trying to eliminate human excellence. And that not only has temporal societal implications, but ultimately it has theological implications because we are eliminating virtue. Ultimately, we're eliminating excellence, and excellence is a manifestation of the good, is a manifestation of divine ideals. And so this really does have spiritual impacts just as much as it has socio-temporal impacts. And so he concludes, I'm as good as you is a useful means for the destruction of democratic societies, but has a far deeper value as an end in itself, as a state of mind which necessarily, excluding humility, charity, contentment, and all the pleasures of gratitude or admiration, turns a human being away from almost every road which might finally lead him to heaven. It is the fear of the Lord that is the beginning of wisdom. If we're not able to engage in genuine fear, in genuine humility before that which is above and beyond us. If instead what we want to do is bring that which is above and beyond down to us in the name of democracy, right, in the name of equality, well, then we're cutting ourselves off from our very purpose. We're cutting ourselves off from our ideal, what it actually means to be human. Note that when Tor and Tinadrill placed themselves in their proper relation to the grand hierarchy, they themselves became glorified. They stepped into the glory and the value and the purpose that was always meant for them as their goal, as their end, as their telos. And so through recognizing their proper station, they were actually exalted even above Mars and Venus, right? They who were made a little bit below the angels are now exalted above the angels. And that is this Christian idea that as you give yourself away in love and sacrifice, you gain yourself back more fully, more truly. But if you're not able to give yourself away, but you instead simply want to take everything down to where you are, you cut yourself off from that path to actual significance, to actual value, toward actual good. And so just as we saw through the Screwtape Letters, now we see in Screwtape Proposes a Toast that the entire demonic angle here, the entire demonic strategy, is to sever you from reality, to make you entirely self-contained, to lead you to grasp at reality, to grasp at the void and pull it into yourself. That's what Satan did, and that's what he wants all of his people to do. And I encourage you, don't do that. Don't grasp with a closed hand, but give yourself over in love toward that which is most lovable. Nothing in you that has not died will ever be raised from the dead. Look for yourself, and you will find in the long run only hatred, loneliness, despair, rage, ruin, and decay. But look for Christ, and you will find him, and with him everything else thrown in. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to our upcoming live discussion on the Screwtape Letters. And in the next video, we will be starting in on that hideous strength. Until next time, Godspeed. Alright, thank you for listening, and thank you for your support of Mythic Mind. Whether you are a subscriber or whether you are a paid patron, I appreciate you moving with us in the various directions that we are going. Now, if you would like to support us financially, and you don't already do so, then head over to patreon.com/mythicmind, and even $5 a month will provide you with a number of perks, such as full Discord access, a patron podcast feed that provides you with all 3 of our podcasts delivered early and ad-free into that one feed for your convenience, and open invitations to our shows and various other things. So that's just $5 a month. Now, become a Tier 3 annual patron or higher, and you'll also get access to all of my courses that begin within that term. That includes, at this point, the Elder Scrolls and Philosophy this fall, the Silmarillion in early 2026, and the Psychology of Soren Kierkegaard, which is going to come in spring of 2026. And if you sign on now, odds are there'll probably be one more course within that term, but I haven't yet decided what that is. But you'll definitely get those 3 courses and everything else that comes along with patronage. And also, patrons get half off the courses of other Mythic Mind creators. And so right now, we have Hannah's Introductory Latin course and Josh's Paradise Lost course. Both of those are completed, which means that patrons can enroll in those courses for half off and just work through them at your own schedule. So that's something that I would definitely recommend to you. All right. Well, before we go, I do want to thank all of my patrons. Right now, we're up to 71 paid patrons, and by name, I'd like to thank all Tier 3 patrons and higher. Many thanks to Mark, Aaron, Amanda, Andrew, Chase, Chaz, Christopher Clinton, David, Don, Aaron, Evie, Adam, Jack, Jamie, Justin, and Kit, who just upgraded to Tier 3, Kyle, Paul, Roger, Ross, Tyler, and William. I really appreciate all of you and what you do to support Mythic Mind, support the various endeavors that I'm trying to lead us on as we go further up and further into the Christian humanities with various applications. Now, if you're listening on the freebie feed, then make sure you're also subscribed to our other shows. Mythic Mind Movies and Shows, where we take a Christian humanities approach to movies and shows. Right now we're working through a Star Wars series. And then also over on Mythic Mind Games, we're doing the same kind of thing, but with video games. And right now we are on a Mass Effect series. And if you're listening to this episode shortly after it comes out, then the next thing to come out from Mythic Mind will be on Friday over on Mythic Mind Games as we talk about Mass Effect 3. Alright, well that's it for now, and until next time, Godspeed.